Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope you really enjoyed the first video on natural versus enhanced training. Of course, it was a beast of a video. It was like over 1 hour long. It was really a full, complete, and free webinar. So I hope that you subscribe so that you get more of these videos in the future. Of course, they will not always be 1 hour long, first of all, because I don't have enough time to do that. And second, because you would probably kill yourself if you have to sit on your computer for an hour and a half every single day I post a video. So if you have not subscribed to the channel yet, I really recommend that you do, because I've been doing some market research, and it seems that people who do subscribe to my channel on average gain around 25 pounds of muscle within the first week they do so. It also cures cancer, and it seems like the most beautiful people in the world are all subscribed to the channel. So what are you waiting for? You should really be getting along with the party. So today's video is basically building on what we saw the last time. But this time, today, I want to give you some brief recommendations on how should you train when you're natural. Next week, I will do the opposite. I will do a video giving recommendation to people who are on steroids or who were on steroids and plan to go off. So how they should train in those two situations. So buckle up, we're gonna get started. So recommendations for the natural lifter. Of course, that is probably most of you. If you're not, I think that it's still interesting to understand the differences and how you apply that so that you can get the most out of your training and help other people if you're a coach. So quick recap, if you have not watched the first video, please do so. Of course, it's a highly theoretical and complete video full of physiology, but it will really help you understand the reasoning behind all the recommendation I'm going to be making today. So for those of you who have not watched the videos or have watched it a week or so ago, some recap, some important point before we move on to my recommendation for natural lifters. First, non-enhanced lifters are more negatively affected by excessive training stress and overall life stress. Basically, it means that if you produce too much cortisol, too much adrenaline because of excessive training, the natural trainee can actually halt his gain and even lose muscle. Because if you create so much muscle damage and have such a high cortisol level that you cannot repair all that muscle damage before the 36 hour after which the anabolic period is over, then you can actually lose muscle. In fact, most people who lose muscle when they diet down, okay? Of course, this is not really related to enhanced versus natural, but it drives the point home. Those of you who lose muscle when dieting down normally do so not because of the reduced caloric intake, but more so because you are doing too much volume. When you're trying to get leaner and get ripped, instinctively, we all start training more. We do more sets, we do more reps, we do like super sets, drop sets, stuff like that. Doing more work because we want to use the session to get cut. But that's actually what leads to muscle loss, because you cause more muscle damage than you can recover from. So you basically, after the 36 hours of enhanced anabolism, the muscle fibers are not fully rebuilt or repaired. So you actually lose tissue, and also you produce too much cortisol for you to handle, because when you're dieting down, you will have higher cortisol levels to start with, all right? Now, excessive cortisol is the #1 enemy of the natural lifters. Enhanced lifters are actually somewhat protected against the muscle loss or muscle breakdown or muscle catabolism of cortisol, because they have such a high amount of anabolic hormones. Then even if they increase their catabolic hormone cortisol slightly or even quite a bit, it's still way below the anabolic level. So they will still build muscle, whereas the natural lifter, if they have too much cortisol, it will be really hard for them to build muscle. They might actually lose some muscle tissue. Now, in training, we saw that we have 6 variables that influence how much cortisol you produce and how much adrenaline you produce. Basically, they are related to the stress level of the session. Volume and intensiveness are the 2 main ones. Volume, of course, being the amount of work you're doing in a session. The reason why volume is correlated with cortisol is that one of the functions of cortisol is to mobilize stored energy. The more volume you do, the more energy you require to fuel your muscles, so the more cortisol you release. So that's the first variable. The second variable that has the greatest impact on cortisol is intensiveness. Not to be mistaken with intensity. Intensity is a percentage of your 1RM. Intensiveness means how hard you are pushing each set. If you go to failure, the set is a lot more intensive than if you stop 2 reps short of failure. The closer you get to failure, the more cortisol you produce, because your body senses that it might die under the bar because it's not sure if it can lift the weight anymore. So it will release cortisol to boost adrenaline. Cortisol increases adrenaline level. So when you need that quick boost in strength, you will pump out cortisol to increase adrenaline. So these are the 2 main ones. We have also secondary variables that are less important but still have an impact and can make or break your training. Psychological stress. So if you get anxious about a lift, about an exercise, or about a workout for various reasons, either because you've never lifted that weight before, because you've never done that movement before, because you got injured on that exercise before and you're not sure about doing it again, or if you're doing a workout and you know it's gonna hurt bad, if you have anxiety or stress before the session, that can actually increase cortisol also. A good sign is that you will have an elevated heart rate, you will have deeper breathing, and you're gonna get hot even if you're not training yet. Okay, neurological demands. How complex are the exercises, or how complex are the motor tasks you have to do? So doing more complicated movement increase how much the brain needs to work, which requires greater neurological activation, which requires adrenaline. And to increase adrenaline, you release more cortisol. Also, if you combine exercises, A1, A2 as a superset, or alternating bench press rowing, doing a circuit, stuff like that, that makes the training more complex, which also increase neurological demands. Doing an exercise you've never done before or you're not comfortable with also increase neurological demands, because the movement is not automatized, so you have to concentrate voluntarily to do the movement. Density. The less rest you take, the more adrenaline increases, which also means cortisol will increase. That's why, by the way, if you don't take long rest intervals, your heart rate will stay high, because in large part of adrenaline. Finally, competitiveness, trying to beat your partner, kill your workout, kill your journal or whatever, beat your record. That will also increase stress slightly. In my opinion, it's the least damaging of these variables, but if everything else is fairly high, it could be the tipping point or the drop of water that actually fill up the glass. Now, last point, both physiological and neurological recovery are affected by hormone use status. So if you are enhanced, you actually recover both more easily, both from a muscle standpoint and also a nervous system standpoint. You're not bulletproof, but you can actually sustain a lot more damage, both neurologically and physiologically, and recover from that. As a natural, you need to take that into consideration when planning your workouts. So these are points that were all discussed in great depth and explained in our full video, the full webinar on natural versus enhanced training. I just wanted to do a quick recap so that even if you don't remember that video fully, or if you haven't watched it, then you can still watch this video and understand what I'm saying and where I'm coming from. Now, before I give you the recommendations, let's look at what I consider natural, okay? First, you need to understand that there's a difference between what could be called natural from an ethical standpoint and what could be called natural from a practical standpoint. Practical meaning that the information that will impact my programming, how I design training program or diets, okay? So you could actually be someone who used drugs in the past. If you have been off drugs for long enough, they don't have an immediate impact on your capacity to tolerate training stress right now. So even though you're not in lifetime natural, at that moment when I'm deciding how to program your training, I will see you as natural. Okay, I know that you're not natural, but from a programming standpoint, you are. Okay. Now, from an ethical standpoint, the natty or natural equals drug-free for life makes sense. The main reason is that even if you stop taking steroids after a while, you might actually maintain or keep some of the gains you made, which gives you somewhat of an advantage over someone who was a true natural, lifetime natural. You also can increase what's called the nuclear domain. So that is responsible for muscle memory, for example. So if you build more muscle via steroid use, you increase the nuclear domain. And even when you lose that muscle, it should, in theory, I'm going to talk about in a moment, in theory, it should allow you to regain muscle faster because of the larger nuclear domain, giving you a slight advantage. Okay. So from an ethical standpoint, being natty could very well mean drug-free for life. From a practical standpoint, it only means that you don't have, in my opinion, the steroids to help you counter the impact of cortisol and adrenaline. Okay, so if you've been off for a few months or a year or so, in my opinion, when it comes to programming or deciding how you are training, I consider you natural, even though you're not a lifetime natural. Difference between practical and ethical. Okay. Now, former steroid users, as I mentioned, can have long-lasting benefits. They might maintain some of the muscle they acquired by being able to train more while enhanced, and they can increase the size of the nuclear domain, allowing them to have what we call muscle memory and regain muscle easier once they lose it and start training hard again naturally. However, I find that not to be the case in most real life situations. I've worked with tons of people who were drug users and stopped. And when they stop for long enough to lose muscle and they start training naturally, they might actually have a harder time than truly natural lifters to progress at that point. Now, don't get me wrong. If, for example, someone built up to a level of being 250 pounds of muscle, then they lose something like 40 pounds when they stop taking steroids for 2 or 3 years. They will still be more muscular than most natural lifters. It will be 205, 210 lean. It's still more muscle than what most natural lifters would achieve. However, from that point on, adding more muscle can actually be harder for the previous steroid user. I'm going to explain why. And that actually depends on how long they were on steroids and what were their dosages like. The main reason is cortisol system adaptation. What happens is, and I mentioned this in the first video, someone takes steroids. What happens is you have so much androgens in your system that the androgens take all the second messengers to send the message from the receptor to the nucleus, leaving almost no messengers for cortisol to send its signal to the cell, to the nucleus of the cell. So cortisol essentially cannot do its job, especially at the muscular level. The body will adapt by producing more cortisol. But since you're still taking way more steroids or androgens than cortisol, than how much cortisol your body can produce, it's still unbalanced. So the body can actually further adapt by increasing the sensitivity of its cortisol receptor or glucocorticoid receptors, those receptors interacting with cortisol. If those receptors are more sensitive, they might be a way to steal away some of these messengers from the androgen receptors, so it can do its job. Normally, that's when gains will stop during a cycle or drastically slow down. What often happens is that the bodybuilder will increase their dosages at that point. Okay, and what happened? The body will try to further adapt by increasing the number of cortisol receptors. So when that happens and the person goes off, he is left with a higher cortisol production, higher cortisol sensitivity, and more cortisol receptors, which is a recipe for losing muscle mass. Now, after a while, cortisol levels will come back down. The sensitivity of the receptors might actually go down, but the number of receptors, if you added receptors, will stay higher. So if you have that situation, the former steroid users could be left with more cortisol receptors, which will make them even more sensitive to cortisol than a true natural. In that case, it will be able to tolerate less volume, less training stress than even a natural lifter, because it will respond much more strongly to cortisol. That's why a lot of bodybuilders become addicted to steroids, because they find that because they were excessive with their cycles, they upregulated cortisol system, and they can now no longer add muscle mass once they go natural, even when they reset natural testosterone production. So that might be one of the reasons why actually someone who goes off steroids, even if he had the benefit of adding more muscle, from that point on, it will actually be even harder for him to progress than a natural lifter. All right. Then last point is someone on TRT natural. First, most people who say they are on TRT, even if it's medically prescribed, oftentimes they are not on TRT. They are on a low dose steroid cycle. The normal testosterone production for a male is 7 to 10 milligrams per day, or roughly 50 to 70 milligrams per week. But when you look at a lot of TRT programs, they prescribe 200 milligrams per week, which is literally 3 to 4 times the natural testosterone level of a man. Now, some will prescribe 200 milligrams per 2 weeks, which is closer to natural level. It will still take you to the higher hand of normal or slightly above that. But the reality is that most people who go on TRT dosage are actually not at the same level as a natural male. True TRT would be 7 to 10 milligrams per day injected subcutaneously, or 50 to 70 milligrams per week intramuscular injection. So if you take that and it brings your testosterone level to normal or high normal levels, then in my opinion, your body will respond the same way as a natural does. You just basically brought testosterone levels that were too low to normal level. So even though you're injecting and the testosterone is not yours, hormonally speaking, you don't have more anabolic hormones than someone who is a normal natural male. Okay. Now, if you inject testosterone at TRT level and it takes you higher than normal range, then you will be closer to someone who's enhanced. You will have an increased capacity. You're no longer natural. So the recommendations I'm going to be making are for those who are natural or who are taking TRT to be in that normal range. So let's go get on with the recommendations, which this video is already too long. So don't forget to like it. As I mentioned, if you like the video, you will automatically gain 5 pounds of muscle. So if you like it twice, it's 10 pounds coming your way. All right. So first recommendation, for each program or phase, select one dominance between volume and intensiveness. Volume and intensiveness are the two variables that have the greatest impact on cortisol and adrenaline. And you want to make sure that cortisol does not become too high. So you cannot have high volume and high intensiveness at the same time when you're natural. Unless it's for a stress spurt, like 2 weeks, and then you take 1 week off afterwards, something like that. That might be doable, but not in a normal training setting. So look at the graphic here. It gives you a pretty good recommendation of the number of work sets per muscle and the level of intensiveness of these work sets. So for example, if you intend to push those work sets to failure, then 5 to 7 work sets per muscle is about right in a session. If you want to do more sets, more volume, 12, 15 sets per muscle, because that's what you like, but you will need to keep 2 or 3 reps in a tank to be able to tolerate that amount of volume, okay? So don't forget, it is technically possible to go for moderate volume, moderate intensity. Here in the graphic, it's like 7.5 to 8.5 RPE with roughly 8 to 10 sets or 8 to 12 sets per muscle. But the reality is that this rarely works, because instinctively you will try to push one of these variables higher. You will get closer and closer to failure. You might have one set to failure once here and there. Then you start to have all your sets to failure, or you add one more set one more exercise because you want to try that movement you saw on YouTube. And very soon, the overall training stress is actually higher than what you can tolerate. So it's much simpler, in my opinion, to have phases of volume dominance and phases of intensiveness dominance. So you could go from accumulation phase to intensification phases. Accumulation, higher volume. Intensification phase, you push your sets higher and higher and higher, and you decrease the volume to be able to do that. So pick one for a phase, and you can push that variable high, but make sure that everything else is in balance so overall training stress doesn't become excessive. Second recommendation, even if you pick a volume dominance for a phase, still stay more conservative than what an enhanced lifter can tolerate. So for example, if you do many muscles in a session, for example, if you train 4 muscles per session, whole body workout, 4 or 5, and you have 4, 5, 6, 7 exercises in a workout, 6 exercises in a workout, you do 6 to 8 sets per muscle, you train 5 muscles in a session, you're still at the 30, 40 work sets in a workout. So even if it technically you do respect the recommendations here of 5 to 7 sets per muscle, the fact that you're training so many muscles in a session, you do a very high total workload for the whole workout, that will have the same negative impact on systemic recovery, cortisol, and adrenaline than if you did more sets per muscle. Now, there are two different systems that are impacted by volume. You have the muscles themselves, the muscle that you're training, and you have the whole system. So you have local and systemic impact. So the local factors would be muscle damage. So how much damage you're causing to one muscle. So that is impacted by the number of sets you do for that muscle. However, systemic stress, which will lead to higher cortisol production, higher adrenaline, and is more likely to stop your gains, refer to the overall volume of the workout. Yeah, but I only did 5 sets per muscle. Yeah, but you trained 6 muscles in a session and you did 30 sets. The overall workload is too high. Okay, so you need to take both into consideration. For a natural trainee, I normally stick to 4 to 5 exercises in a workout. Okay, so if you're training 2 muscles, that would be 2 or 3 exercises for a muscle. If you're training 4 muscles, it would be 1 exercise per muscle, for example. Out of these 4 or 5, 2 or 3 would be big lifts, big basic compound movements. The rest would be less demanding machine or isolation exercises. So we're shooting for an overall volume of maybe 8 to 16 work sets, maybe up to 20 for a session, which is tolerable. And a natural lifter can probably go up to 20 total work sets in a session, but still, you should not exceed 10 to 12 for a single muscle. That's important. Okay. Always be safer when it comes to volume. Start lower, and if you find you tolerate it well, you can gradually increase it within reason. Recommendation number 3, if you want to do more volume than the 20 sets per session for overall, you must decrease secondary stressors. Remember, secondary stressors are psychological stress, neurological demands, density or rest intervals, and competitiveness. So if you want to do more than the 16 to 20 total work set for some reason, maybe you want to do a blitz, maybe you need more work on some specific muscle group to fix a weakness, maybe you want to do more sets per exercise because you want to train for strength, and strength normally will require a greater number of sets to practice that exercise more, greater neurological adaptation. Okay, so if you want to do more volume for some reason, you will use a greater proportion of machine and isolation movement. That will decrease neurological demands and psychological stress. That doesn't mean you stop the big lifts. You can keep 1 or 2 in a session. The rest would be lower stress movements. Keep rest intervals longer. I'm going to get back to that point in a moment, but that is the easiest way to decrease cortisol and adrenaline without affecting the results of the workout. stick with exercises and methods you're comfortable with that will also decrease neurological demands and psychological stress, which is not to be neglected when it comes to lowering overall training stress. And don't train competitively. Okay, you still need to train hard, but don't put too much pressure on yourself to increase performance. Lowering these 4 variables will allow you to tolerate a little bit more volume and a little bit more intensiveness combined. 4th recommendation for natural lifters: if you use a period of higher volume or higher training stress, it should be no longer than 3 to 4 weeks, and you should follow it by a deload lasting 7 to 10 days. Okay, the role of the deload is to lower cortisol, which will lower adrenaline, allowing you to resensitize the receptors that might have been downregulated by overproducing adrenaline. What we call overtraining, what I call training burnout, is simply that you produce so much cortisol that it led to very high adrenaline level, and that high adrenaline level made your beta adrenergic receptors resistant to adrenaline, leading to lower strength, less power, less coordination, less motivation, also less cardiovascular capacity. When you deload, the purpose is simply to decrease training stress. So cortisol is lower, adrenaline is lower. Less adrenaline allows the receptors to become resensitized. So if you do a period of high training stress, follow it with a deload. Now, deloading can be accomplished by decreasing any of the 6 variables I mentioned earlier: volume, intensiveness, psychological stress, neurological demands, density, competitiveness. The higher the training stress was in your blitz, the more of these variables you need to lower to be able to recover. Last point, during a deload, you need to increase caloric intake and increase carbohydrates intake. Most people do the opposite because they're training less training, less workouts, less volume, and they are afraid of getting fat, so they eat less. In reality, the sole purpose of a deloading week is to recover and also restore beta adrenergic sensitivity. So you actually want to minimize cortisol and adrenaline as much as possible. Carbohydrates are the best supplement. It's not really a supplement, but it's the best thing to decrease cortisol, because 2 functions of cortisol are mobilizing stored energy and increasing blood sugar levels when they are too low. By having carbs frequently throughout the day, you have more readily available energy and blood sugar level is higher, so you don't need to break down glycogen stores, which means you don't need to release as much cortisol. So lower volume, lower intensiveness, lower other variables, and also increase caloric intake as well as carbohydrates. 5th recommendation for natural lifters: train each muscle, at least indirectly, 2 or 3 times a week. The reason is that a natural lifter needs the actual session to increase protein synthesis in that muscle. Enhanced lifters, they take steroids, which increases protein synthesis or muscle building 24/7. As long as the steroid is in the body, they will have increased protein synthesis. Natural lifters will have an increase in protein synthesis for 30 to 36 hours after the workout. So if you train each muscle only once a week, you have 30 to 36 hours of potential enhanced growth out of the 168 hours of the week. If you train that muscle 2 or 3 times a week, you can go up to 72 or even 108 hours where you're actually building that muscle. Okay, so from my experience, hitting a muscle 2 to 3 times a week is best for hypertrophy for the natural lifter. Now, that doesn't mean having an exercise specifically for each muscle 2 or 3 times a week, because you have indirect stimulation. When you do a bench press, you're not just training your chest. The triceps and anterior deltoids are working. When you're doing a chin-up, it's not just the lats, it will be the biceps, forearms, brachialis, okay, rear delts. So there is some crossover, but you need to have each muscle be stimulated to some extent 2 or 3 times a week for maximum results. Now, when it comes to hypertrophy, increasing frequency more than that is likely not to be beneficial, because you still need to create enough of a stimulus, enough of a stress to trigger protein synthesis when it comes to hypertrophy. So what happens is, if you're training a muscle too often, you will either not be able to recover. If you're doing enough volume per session to make that session effective, you might not be able to recover fast enough if your sessions are 4, 5, 6 days a week. Or each session will not be demanding enough for a muscle to trigger adaptations. For example, Olympic weightlifters will snatch, clean and jerk, and squat 5 or 6 days a week. But the reason is that the more often you practice a skill, the more automatic it becomes, the better intra and intermuscular coordination becomes, the more your technique improves, the more efficient it becomes. So you increase strength by factors other than adding muscle mass. But for hypertrophy, 2 or 3 times a week where you hit a muscle is ideal. Recommendation number 6. Even with an increase in frequency per muscle group, you don't want to increase the overall frequency of training sessions per week unless you go super low volume. I wrote a series called the Best Damn Training Program for Natural Lifters, which in some cases use as many as 6 sessions per week. But each session essentially had 4 work sets. So that's extremely low volume, very high intensiveness, but extremely low volume. So it can be tolerable for 4 or 6 days a week. But if we were talking a normal program, you probably should train 3 or 4 days a week if you're natural, because you want those off days to be able to bring cortisol and adrenaline back down and to maximize the benefits of the enhance in anabolism. So you spike anabolism on Monday. So on Tuesday, you're recovering, so you're taking advantage of all that anabolism without causing further breakdown or further fatigue. So some good splits that I like would be the whole body workout 3 days a week. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we do whole body workouts, which include normally 4 or 5 exercises in the session, which would be 2 or 3 big lifts and 1 or 2 smaller movements covering the whole body. That's why I like to do those big movements. If you have a bench press, a squat, and a row, you're basically covering the whole body, at least to some extent. And when I use that whole body approach, I normally will have a 4th workout, which I call the gap workout. The gap workout uses only minor exercises, isolation or machine or cable exercises, very low stress, to focus on muscles that might have been neglected or not fully stimulated by the big basic lift. For example, me, I'm quads dominant. If I'm squatting 3 days a week and I don't have any other lower body movement, then my glutes and hamstring will not get full stimulations. I might want to work those. I'm triceps dominant. So when I bench press, my triceps take the brunt of the work. Maybe I will need more isolation work for the pectorals on a gap workout. So that you use the gap workout to fix your weaknesses. So that's the split I use the most with my own personal clients. Other good split, because not everybody like that full body workout, you could go upper, lower, very traditional, very effective split. You could go whole body, one workout will be whole body, then you have 1 upper body and 1 lower body workout if you can train 4 days a week. You could even have whole body workout, then an upper body workout, a lower body workout, then a gap session if you want to train 4 days a week. That's also very effective. You could go push, pull. But what I do when I do that, I will put quadriceps in a push workout and hamstrings or glutes in a pull workout. So everything gets hit twice. Or you can go more of a typical bodybuilding split, chest and biceps, legs, back and triceps, deltoids and rear delts. Okay, so everything besides legs get some form of stimulation twice a week. Because when you do rear delts, you also work the back slightly. When you do chest, you also work triceps and delts. When you do back, you also work biceps. So you might want to add like 1 lower body exercise with the delt session if you want to hit everything twice. But these are good splits you can use to maximize training frequency for each muscle, or optimize it, sorry, without exceeding the number of recoverable sessions per week. 7 recommendation, don't kill your gains with excessive warm-up sets, okay? Just because a warm-up set is low in intensiveness, normally it's between 3 and 6, it still has an impact on cortisol because it does require fuel. Not as much as a normal set, but it's not negligible. If you do 4 warm-up sets for every single exercise you do in the workout, that essentially double or even triple the training volume, it will have a big impact on cortisol. The purpose of a warm-up set is to prepare your muscles, your joints, your nervous system to the task at hand. Just to getting you warmed up, getting the muscles ready, getting activated. It also allows you to better select the weight of your working set. You can, okay, how that weight feels, how much weight you think you're going to be able to lift on those work sets. So to me, that's a great benefit of those warm-up. But you don't need 10 warm-up sets to know, okay, today I need to go a bit lighter, today I can handle a bit more weight. And also, if you want to practice the exercise and get used to the heavier weight. So if you're not good at squatting, you might want to do more sets to get in the squatting groove, for example. So you certainly will need more warm-up sets for the bigger lift, like a squat, like a deadlift, or even a bench press, especially if they're first in the session and you're cold, for example. Most of my clients will use 3, maybe 4 warm-up sets. I don't include empty bar in that warm-up, okay? It's sets where you actually have at least 50% on the bar. So they will normally do 3 or 4 warm-up sets. Of course, if they can squat 800, they will not do only 4 warm-up sets, because you cannot go from empty bar to 800 pounds in 4 work sets, 4 warm-up sets. You will need a bit more. But normally, for most people, 3, 4 warm-up sets is more than enough on those big lifts. And on the minor exercises, you might only need 1. Especially if you're already warmed up for that muscle group. If you, for example, if you did your squat, and then you have leg press afterwards, you don't need 4 warm-up sets on leg presses. Your legs are fully warmed up. You only need one. You need 1 warm-up to figure out which weight you're going to be using for your work sets. That's it. If I'm doing, say, bench press, then I go to rope tricep extension. I might not even need a warm-up sets. Okay, I'm not telling you not to do them. Only do them if they're required to enhance the quality of a workout, and understand that they will have an impact on cortisol and how much volume you can tolerate. I'm going to make it smaller. All right. 8th recommendation, increase your rest intervals. Okay. And I was guilty of the opposite myself. I like to train fast. Why? Because I respond really well to adrenaline. It really amps me up. So I always perform better when I rested with short rest intervals. However, that does mean more cortisol, and it does mean more adrenaline, and it increases the risk of burning out and losing your gains. If you're enhanced, if you're taking steroids, that's not a big deal. If you're natural, you actually want to lengthen those rest intervals slightly, not so that you're necessarily more rested for your exercises, simply to lower adrenaline and lower cortisol. To prevent those negative side effects from happening. Now, the optimal rest period would still give you some potentiation effect. Potentiation effect is every time you do an exercise, a set, you increase neurological activation that comes from adrenaline, and that increases performance. As long as the nervous system is potentiated, you will be stronger the next set, provided that fatigue is not holding you back. Okay, so what you want is to decrease fatigue, and you want to maintain some potentiation. So you have the 2 graphs here that illustrate how you recover from a normal set. What I figure out is on the big lifts, I recommend 4 minutes between sets, the work sets, of course. On the more moderate or intermediate movements, you might go 3 minutes between sets. And on the minor stuff like isolation or exercise or machine work, you might go as low as 2 minutes. But honestly, if you're natural, increasing your rest intervals is probably the easiest way to lower stress, lower cortisol, without negatively impact how effective that workout is for building muscle. Recent studies showed that you can actually trigger more growth with slightly longer rest intervals because the average weight you can lift will be higher at the same effort level. So these are my 8 top recommendations when it comes to a natural trainee. I'm going to end here because in my mind, that video was going to be 15 minutes long. My partner Jess is probably like shouting at me on her screen right now, shut the fuck up, shut the fuck up. But I am what I am. I like to talk, and hopefully you got a lot of good information from that video. The next one is going to be the opposite, recommendation for enhanced lifters. So stay tuned and be sure to check out the first video I did on natural versus enhanced lifter. It will greatly help you understand all of these concepts. This is Coach Tib telling you up to next time.